Her undermycket, her öli, her maulmycket, hermans banna, ens etha fleri. Hear of a great wonder, hear of a peace broken, hear of a great matter, hear of a death, of one man's or more. This verse is spoken by Thorkel Surson in Gisli's saga after he hears a particular insult that he suspects will lead to a great feud between friends and family and lead to many, many deaths. And his suspicion is quite accurate. Now, this isn't the best skaldic verse or the most well-composed verse that the Icelandic sagas have to offer, but it does encapsulate the driving forces of almost all of the Icelandic sagas, that of personal honor, feud, and vengeance. Welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sjón, and I'm a medievalist who specializes in Old Norse Icelandic literature, language, and history. And I just saw the Northman a few days ago, and I have so many thoughts. Now, I've read most of the Íslendingasögur, the family sagas, the sagas of the Icelanders, as well as most of the fornaldarsögur, the sagas of old, the legendary sagas. But not only that, I'm quite obsessed with Sjón, who is the co-writer of the Northman. I've read almost all of his books, or I've read all of his books, and he's one of my favorite living authors. And so I mention all of this right at the start, not to boast or to elevate my own opinion over anyone else's, honestly, just to point out that this movie was like tailor-made for me. I've been talking for years about why Hollywood needs to adapt the Icelandic sagas. They are some of the most cinematic and dramatic stories to come out of the Middle Ages. And I think that the Northman does an exceptional job of adapting the medieval saga world version of the Viking Age for the big screen. I find so many adaptations of the Vikings to be so obsessed with portraying gritty realism that they lose sight of the larger mythic world that in which all of these stories, or most of these stories, take place. So in this video, I just want to talk about some of the things that I, as a medievalist who not only researches and teaches the sagas, but who just genuinely adores them, what I like about the Northman, and what I like specifically about its sort of adaptation theory and the way that it goes about adapting the medieval sagas. And this video might be a bit all over the place, so fair warning, I'm not attempting to do a thorough review of the Northman or anything like that by any means. And of course, spoiler warning for the Northman, obviously. And let me just start by saying that I think this movie is genuinely pretty amazing. I think Amleth is the perfect saga protagonist. And what I mean by a saga protagonist is that he's super understated. He never really expresses his emotions outside of anger. And he doesn't actually even talk that much. Or rather, he does speak, but he speaks through silence. And if you've read any of the sagas, you know that so many of the characters act like this. They very rarely express themselves. And the sagas themselves have this very impersonal narration where we're never really told what the characters are thinking, what's going on inside of their heads. We'll just get a sentence that just says something like, "Then Thorkel raised his axe and struck Gunnar." And it's left to the reader and the audience to infer why Thorkel just did that act of violence. This is a problem with the sagas that a lot of modern readers run into because we're used to much more indulgent, much more psychologically probing narratives with our stories in kind of the genre of the modern novel. But I really like this way of storytelling because it leaves so much work up to the reader. It leaves the analysis and the inferences up to us to make. And I think this actually leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And I think the Northman does an exceptional job of conveying that same kind of impersonal narrative style. Anyways, let's back up for a second. The Northman is clearly drawing its skeleton structure, the main story of Amleth, from Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, which in books, I think 3 and mainly in 4, he retells the story of Amleth. And I'm not going to go into detail here about the differences between Saxo's version and Eggers and Sjón's version or anything like that. Go watch Philip Chase's video if you want to see someone do that more effectively. But what I like so much about the Northman is how they are using Saxo's story of Amleth to provide the skeleton of this story, but they're effectively adapting that story of Amleth into the medieval Viking imaginary or Viking fantasy that the medieval sagas depict and explore. That is, while Saxo provides the structure for the story, I think Eggers and Sjón are most influenced by and inspired by the Icelandic sagas. And quick note, I'm using the term Vikings quite loosely for the sake of convenience in this video. Viking is a profession, not a race or a people or a genetic term. If someone tells you that they have Viking ancestry, that's about as useful as me telling you that I have cobbler ancestry. It makes no sense at all. But the reason I feel comfortable using the term Viking here is that the Northman is indulging in a kind of Viking imaginary. And what I mean by Viking imaginary or Viking fantasy is this mythic world that is kind of based in history, but is also sort of outside of it. Think of the Old West in America, the Wild West. We have so many movies and books that are based within this story world that clearly aren't historically accurate, but they're not completely divorced from history. The history of the Vikings have all of these different imaginaries throughout history, right? We have our own ideas of what the Vikings were. The Victorians had their own ideas. For the Victorians, they were filled with, men with golden beards and horned helmets. But what I really want to focus on here, and what I think the Northman is really trying to adapt, is the medieval saga version of the Viking Age, rather than the historical reality of the Viking Age. The saga authors of medieval Iceland reimagined and adapted their own history as descendants of these people, and they rewrote it and created the world of the sagas, occasionally drawing from history and occasionally straying quite far from it. And this isn't to say, of course, that the Icelandic sagas have no historical validity. Of course, they have a lot of historical validity, but we have to deal with the fact that most of the sagas take place during the Viking Age, usually during kind of the latter half of the Viking Age. The Viking Age is, let's say, 793 to about 1066, and almost all of the medieval Icelandic sagas are written between the years 1200 and 1400. So there is a pretty big time gap, and there's also ideological gaps as well, as all the saga authors, as far as we can tell, were Christian. And so we have to always be grappling with this perspective of these people looking back on their ancestors' history and rewriting it. And in fact, Icelanders haven't stopped rewriting this history or rewriting these sagas since the Middle Ages. They continue to do so to this day. So much of our idea about who the Vikings are isn't so much based in history as it is in later medieval perceptions of that same history. And this is really, for me, where the Northman shines, in recreating a Viking epic that is immersed in the world of the sagas, where they're not afraid to delve into the supernatural or fantastical elements of these stories. I suspect that Sjón had a big part to play in why the Northman feels so mythic. That's kind of his specialty. But the reason I like this direction so much is that it makes the Northman do exactly what the fornaldarsögur do in the Middle Ages. That is, they don't necessarily take place in history, but they take place in a mythic version of that history. So as a historian, I guess I can kind of call myself a historian, what I liked about the Northman is its attention to historical detail, especially when it comes to material culture. They did an exceptional job as far as I can tell, though I'm no expert in material culture. But as a literary studies academic, what I liked more was how it took a kind of medieval Viking fantasy, the perception of that history that the sagas explore, and ran with it and created something entirely new. Because this is exactly what medieval saga writers did, and this is exactly what medieval historians did. They weren't restrained by history, but freed by it. And this view of history is just something that I particularly like. It's much more in line with medieval writers than it is with a lot of modern historians. But I think this is really what elevates the Northmen from just a very good historical fiction movie to a mythic and epic Viking fantasy. So take, for example, the various rituals that we see in the Northman. Now, we know surprisingly little about pre-Christian rituals in Germanic tribes, in Germanic groups. This isn't to say we don't know anything. I mean, go read some stuff by Neil Price, his book, The Viking Way. And there are plenty of scholars who are working on shamanism and rituals in pagan Germanic groups. And they do absolutely wonderful work, but they're very dependent on archaeology, and they often have to kind of triangulate with other groups that do shamanism in order to kind of figure out what these Nordic pagan rituals were. And when it comes to literary depictions of these rituals, we're almost entirely in the dark. I mean, I can think of like 2 or 3 examples from the Íslendingasögur which depict in detail a pagan ritual. We really don't see it that often. But what's interesting is that we're not alone in that. The medieval saga authors also needed to sort of do some guesswork when they wanted to depict these things because, well, they were Christian. Like it or not, they were Christian. And so we're really unsure how seriously we can take their depictions of these pagan rituals. And in fact, in some instances, we actually might know more than the medieval saga authors, even though they were closer to the pre-Christian era, as so much of what we know about these rituals come from modern archaeology. But the Northman takes this freedom and runs with it in so many brilliant ways. I think we see this especially towards the beginning in these very masculine, almost like warrior cult rituals that we see that really play up this animalism of the male warrior, which is of course very closely linked to the Berserkir, the Berserks, which the Northmen depict in detail. The Berserks, or the Ulfheðnar, which the latter word just means wolf skin, it's theorized that these 2 groups, the Berserkers and the Ulfheðnar, were 2 different kind of warrior cults that kind of get pushed together in the sagas. But these groups are very mythologized in modern adaptations. It seems like everyone has a theory about what the Berserks, who they were and what they did and how they did what they did. We get theories from everything like they would take psychedelic drugs, they would take mushrooms before battle, which to me always seems like a really silly idea. Have you ever seen someone tripping on a mushroom? Now imagine that person in a shield wall. It doesn't really make any sense. 2 theories about how the Berserks would fight without their shirt on, which is the etymological root to the word berserk, bare shirt. There is, of course, also the possibility that this ber in berserk meant bear, as the homonym exists in Old Norse as it does in English, or at least in Proto-Old Norse. So we have all these different theories, and there's really still no consensus among scholars which theory is correct. And many scholars have actually even argued that the Berserks in history in the Viking Age are actually quite different than the Berserks that we see in the sagas, and that the word, whatever the word was denoting, sort of shifted over time. And these scholars often argue that the sagas actually got the word wrong, that the literary depictions of berserks in the sagas are probably quite different than what they were in history, which kind of makes sense. If you read the sagas, the people who are described as berserks from saga to saga are often very different. But the Northman, of course, goes with the bare shirt route, that they fight without shirts, but they retain this animalistic quality. And this really fits with most of the literary sources, at least the saga literary sources. And it makes sense why Amleth at one point calls himself Bjorn Ulfr, literally bear wolf. It seems that he's kind of channeling his inner Beowulf or Burvar Bjarki. And Skarsgård's depiction of being a berserk is just amazing. I mean, he moves more like a wolf than a human in most of the scenes. It's so damn good. Another thing I really liked about the Northmen is how they effectively incorporated these, what we might call supernatural or fantastical elements into the story, into this otherwise gritty and realistic movie. Some of my favorite scenes are when they depart from reality to enter a new reality. And I'm being very careful with my words here because the way in which we describe these moments, whether they're supernatural or paranormal or fantastic, depends on the truth value of these scenes. It depends on whether or not the audience and the author actually believed that these things existed, or if they were just mere fancy. Go read some of the scholarship of Ármann Jakobsson if you want more on this terminology. But anyways, this movie had a damn Draugr, which was awesome, and this scene was very much inspired, clearly, I would have to suspect, by the scene in Grettir's saga, where Grettir infiltrates a mound and encounters this mound dweller, this Draugr, named Kár in Gamla, Kár the Old. And Grettir steals a sword just like Amleth does. But it's so good, and this scene is so clearly inspired by Grettir's saga. And they do such a good job of depicting the ship burial, the Draugr, and everything. I mean, Amleth even does to the Draugr's head exactly what Grettir does. You need to do that, by the way, otherwise the Draugr might come back to life. But that scene is easily one of my favorite scenes. The way it moves between reality and the fantastic makes perfect sense for any reader of the sagas. That's exactly how the sagas move back and forth between these two realities, if we should even be calling these two different realities. In some ways, they're the same reality. We also see these like dreams of the Valkyries coming down to get different warriors and bringing them up across Bifrost to Ausgarður, presumably to Valhall, Odin's hall, where they will, party and train until they're called into battle during Ragnarok. And once again, I really think we have to thank Sjón for these moments, as he really seems to understand the close connection between reality and the fantastic in modern thought, but also very much in the medieval worldview. I want to talk a little bit about feuds, though, because what is really driving the Northmen, just like in the opening quote that I suggested, drives most of the sagas of the Icelanders, is feud and the concept of revenge in the medieval Icelandic worldview. Now, a man hell-bent on revenge is a familiar motif to readers of the sagas. And I think the Northman does an exceptional job of showing the psychological torment of a man who has yet to take revenge. That is, in the medieval Nordic worldview, taking revenge isn't an option. If someone kills your kin, you need to take revenge. Being a child when that first murder happens is not like a get out of revenge free card. That being said, I do think that the Northmen could have explored a bit more the interpersonal effects, the sociological impulses and forces that play into feuds and into revenge, because this is really the driving force of feud in the sagas. I mean, I think in the Northmen, they wanted to focus solely on Amleth as an individual, as that kind of story often works just better on film. And I do think that modern readers and viewers like stories more about individuals than they do about groups of people. But in the sagas, for instance, there's a recurring figure named Snorri Gothi. He appears in a whole bunch of different sagas. And he gets a lot of flack in all of the sagas for not having taken revenge for the murder of his father. His father was murdered when he was 6 years old. And in almost every saga that he appears, another character will impugn his honor for not having grown up and taken revenge. Snorri Gothi chooses to live with this shame, but it comes at a very serious cost to his reputation. And to be fair, we do see this a bit in the Northmen, where we get characters like Olga and even Queen Guthrun later on encouraging Amleth to take revenge. And this is quite common. Women's words of encouragement often whetted the blades of many a man in the sagas. And this was actually something that I think the Northmen also did exceptionally well, was the depiction of women and how they very rarely in the sagas take center stage, but they're always just behind center stage, often controlling the action of their male relations. The sagas are filled with so many amazing female characters who, again, regrettably, very rarely take center stage, although occasionally they do. But this doesn't mean that they didn't have volition or their own power. They did. It was just it's displayed in the sagas and in the Northmen in much more subtle, kind of behind the scenes ways. And I think that both Olga and Guthrun are exceptionally well wrought, and you can find their likeness in countless sagas. But anyways, since Amleth was essentially incognito the whole time, the Northmen kind of had to neglect the sociological impetus of revenge and of feud. Though I did really like how we have these two ravens, which are clearly Othin's ravens, right? Huganok Mugen, thought and memory, who constantly serve as these reminders to Amleth that, hey, you gotta hurry up, you gotta take revenge at some point. Othin kind of controlling the fate of these warriors. We see this in sagas like Völsunga saga and Hrolfsaga Kraka, as he's very much in the background, or in those sagas he is not in the background, he comes down in material form to encourage these feuds to happen. But it really shows how much control he had. I mean, to quote the Old English poem, The Wanderer, "Wir bith fol arad," fate is inexorable, or fate is inescapable. And these two ravens throughout the Northmen really symbolize that. They serve as a direct reminder of Amleth's moral and social duty to take revenge. So yeah, I mean, it's all just so good. I mean, when you can make the climax of a film two men naked fighting inside Hekla, which was often called the gates of hell in medieval Iceland, I mean, how can you get much better than that? I did see a few people online actually criticizing the accents in the Northmen. I wanted to touch on that briefly because I think that criticism is actually quite unwarranted. I think the accents in the Northmen are actually quite good. They're supposed to be all over the place. The Viking world was massive. It spread from everywhere from Garthariki in the east, modern day Russia, all the way to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America for a time. And so accents would have varied substantially across this region, right? This isn't a world with a standardized language. They don't have a received pronunciation version of Old Norse. But so all of these different accents would have often kind of come to a head in Iceland specifically, because during at least the settlement age of Iceland, when it was first being settled in the 8th and 9th centuries, you had people from all over Norway and the British Isles and from elsewhere coming and settling in Iceland. Iceland is very much, in the Middle Ages, an immigrant community. And so I think the accents make sense. It makes sense why you would have a woman with an Irish accent speaking to a man with a Eastern European accent. Oh, and one more thing. I actually really liked how none of the characters, at least from what I remember, had tattoos. Now, I'm not against tattoos at all, and I have no evidence that Vikings didn't have tattoos. But there's also almost zero evidence that Vikings did have tattoos, contrary to almost every single modern adaptation of Vikings. But the reason I think this is worth pointing out, and the reason I actually liked it, is because I think it shows that Sjón and Eggers weren't influenced by modern adaptations of Vikings, and they were much more influenced by the medieval source material. And that's something that I just really appreciate. So I really think that the Northmen did an exceptional job of adapting these medieval worldviews and this medieval saga world and translating them to the modern cinema. It's not only a really smart, I think, and very learned adaptation of these stories, but it's fun as hell, and it's gorgeous. I mean, the only real complaint I have is that I wish Björk had more screen time. So if you're interested, I'm planning on making a video soon about some of the texts that the Northman is clearly drawing from and providing a kind of reading list of both medieval and modern sources that viewers of the Northman, people who like the Northman, might want to read. So stick around for that if that's something that interests you. That video should be out soon. But let me know what you made of the Northman. I know I, for one, cannot wait to see it again, but I'm very interested to hear what other people made of the film. But for now, thanks for watching.